My name is Isabel Wheeler, and I'm 29 years old. The grand ballroom inside the Whitmore Hotel was overflowing with nearly 200 guests. Every one of them someone my father had gathered over almost 4 decades. Business partners, longtime clients, distant relatives who only seemed to appear when there was free food and an open bar. It felt like everyone who had ever crossed his path was there. The applause echoed through the room as my father, Gerald Wheeler, stood at the head table in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, lightly tapping a fork against his champagne glass to get everyone's attention. Tonight was his retirement celebration, the grand finale to a career that had transformed Wheeler and Associates from a tiny 2-room office into one of the most respected accounting firms in the state. I had driven across 3 states just to be there. Not because we were especially close. Truth be told, we hadn't been for years. I came because deep down I still hoped this night might be different. I figured maybe retirement would soften him. Maybe, just maybe, he'd finally say something that made me feel like I actually belonged in his family instead of always standing on the outside looking in. My husband, Theo, sat beside me, quietly squeezing my hand beneath the table. He could always tell when my nerves started getting the best of me. "I hope your dad surprises you tonight," I whispered. Theo offered a small smile, though I could tell he wasn't exactly holding his breath. Neither was I. Just a few seats away sat my older brother, Preston, with his wife and their 2 perfectly dressed kids. They looked like something straight out of a holiday catalog. The picture-perfect family my father had spent years showing off every chance he got. Growing up, Preston was always the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the one whose smallest accomplishments were celebrated like national headlines. I spent years chasing the same approval, but somehow it always stayed just out of reach. Still, I told myself tonight wasn't about old wounds. It was about celebrating my father's career. Nothing more. Gerald cleared his throat, and the conversations around the ballroom faded into silence. He started exactly the way everyone expected. He thanked his employees for their loyalty. He praised his clients for trusting the firm. He joked that he definitely wouldn't miss Monday morning traffic, earning a wave of laughter from nearly every table. Everything felt normal. Until it didn't. His expression shifted. He slowly lifted his champagne glass higher and looked across the room before saying, "Only the children who truly made me proud deserve to carry my name." The guests erupted into applause. People nodded. Glasses clinked together. Some even laughed, thinking he delivered some deep, heartfelt wisdom. But my stomach dropped. I already knew where this was headed. Then my father's eyes locked directly onto mine. The applause gradually faded as people realized he wasn't finished. In front of 200 guests. In front of coworkers who had watched me grow up. In front of my husband. He looked me straight in the eye and said 3 words I'll never forget. "You can leave." That was it. No explanation. No hesitation. Just 3 cold words delivered as casually as if he were asking a waiter to clear away an empty plate. The heat rushed into my face. My ears started ringing. For a second, it honestly felt like the entire ballroom tilted beneath me. Every single head turned in my direction. Someone near the back let out an awkward chuckle, probably thinking this had to be some kind of joke. It wasn't. My father's face stayed completely calm. No anger. No regret. Just the look of a man who believed he'd finally said something he'd wanted to say for years. And in that instant, every painful memory crashed into me at once. The birthdays he skipped because work came first. The graduation he missed. The promotions I chased, hoping he'd finally tell me he was proud. Even my wedding speech, where he spent more time praising Theo's career than acknowledging mine. Every moment suddenly made perfect sense. I had spent my entire life trying to earn something he had already decided he would never give me. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of the table. What was I supposed to do? Argue? Beg? Pretend none of this was happening? No way. Slowly, I pushed back my chair. The scraping sound across the polished floor seemed impossibly loud inside the silent ballroom. I stood, feeling hundreds of eyes fixed on me. Some looked uncomfortable. Some looked sympathetic. Others couldn't hide their curiosity. I honestly believed this was how my relationship with my father would end, with me quietly walking away while everyone watched. So I turned toward the exit and took my first step. Before I could take another step, another chair scraped loudly across the ballroom floor. I stopped. The sound pulled every eye away from me. Theo calmly rose to his feet. He didn't rush. He didn't show a hint of panic. With the same steady confidence I'd seen him carry into countless boardrooms, he buttoned his navy suit jacket and looked straight at my father. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. My father frowned, clearly confused. Theo wasn't supposed to interrupt. If anything, Gerald probably expected him to quietly follow me out without making a fuss. That had always been my father's mistake. He'd never really taken Theo seriously. To him, Theo was simply my husband, the quiet guy sitting beside me at family dinners. He never bothered learning about the career Theo had built, or the influence he'd earned on his own. Dad had spent years assuming Theo was just another supporting character in my life. He couldn't have been more wrong. Theo reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. The movement was slow and deliberate. No drama. No theatrics. But somehow, it made the entire ballroom hold its breath. Then he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried effortlessly across the silent room. "Before my wife walks out of here," he said, "there's something every single person in this ballroom deserves to hear." The room froze. Conversations disappeared. Even the waitstaff stopped moving. For the first time all night, I watched my father's confident smile begin to fade. Just a little, but enough. Theo gave my hand one reassuring squeeze before stepping away from our table and into the open space near the podium. Every guest leaned forward. People could sense something big was coming. Theo looked directly at Gerald. "You spent your speech talking about legacy," he began calmly. "About pride. About which of your children deserve to carry your name." He paused for just a second. "I think everyone here also deserves to know how that legacy was actually protected over the last year and a half." The words landed like a punch. My father's jaw tightened. His fingers wrapped around the edge of the podium so firmly that his knuckles turned white. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine uncertainty on his face. Theo continued without raising his voice. 18 months ago, Wheeler and Associates was one mistake away from losing its largest client. Whispers immediately spread across nearby tables. Theo didn't acknowledge them. He simply kept going. The issue started after a major compliance filing was mishandled. The client nearly requested a full federal review, and if that had happened, the firm would have lost close to 40% of its annual revenue. I slowly turned toward Preston. The color had completely drained from his face. His confident smile had vanished. His wife stared at him in disbelief. Theo never mentioned Preston by name. He didn't have to. Everyone in that room was smart enough to connect the dots. The client stayed, Theo continued, because an outside consulting firm quietly stepped in. We reorganized the account, worked directly with regulators, rebuilt the client's confidence, and stabilized the relationship before anyone outside the executive offices realized how serious things had become. The ballroom was completely silent. You could have heard a glass hit the floor. Then Theo revealed the part no one saw coming. My consulting firm handled every bit of that work. Gasps echoed around the room. Several guests exchanged stunned looks. Someone whispered, "You've got to be kidding me." Another person simply muttered, "No way." Theo nodded once. We never asked for public recognition. We never requested credit. We did it because Isabel deserved better than watching her father's company collapse. I looked toward Gerald. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. For perhaps the first time in his entire career, he had absolutely nothing to say. Theo wasn't finished. I stayed quiet because I respected my wife. He glanced back at me with a small, reassuring smile. I refused to turn her father's mistakes into leverage inside our marriage. His eyes returned to Gerald. But I also refused to stand here and watch a man humiliate his own daughter after spending the Last 18 months benefiting from help he'll never admit he needed. The silence that followed felt even heavier than before. No applause. No laughter. Just hundreds of people realizing they had walked into a retirement celebration, only to witness decades of hidden favoritism begin falling apart in real time. For several long seconds, nobody dared to speak. The ballroom that had been buzzing with laughter only moments earlier now felt frozen in place. Every guest seemed caught between shock and curiosity, waiting to see who would break the silence first. Finally, my father cleared his throat. His voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. "This isn't the time," Gerald said, forcing a tight smile. "And it's certainly not the place for this conversation." Theo didn't flinch. He stood there with the same calm expression he'd worn from the moment he got up. With all due respect, he replied evenly. There was never going to be a perfect time. 30 years passed without one. Tonight just happened to be the moment you decided to publicly humiliate your own daughter. The words landed hard. A wave of whispers rolled through the room. Several of my father's former colleagues exchanged uneasy glances. Others stared at him, quietly reevaluating the man they thought they knew. Across the head table, Preston suddenly pushed back his chair. It scraped loudly across the marble floor. His wife immediately reached for his arm, quietly urging him to sit back down, but he barely noticed. His face had gone pale. His confident posture was gone, replaced by panic that was getting harder to hide. He looked like someone desperately trying to figure out how much everyone else already knew. The conversations around the ballroom grew louder. People weren't celebrating anymore. They were connecting dots. Little details that never seemed important before suddenly made a whole lot more sense. I recognized one of the firm's senior partners standing near the front. She slowly rose from her seat, her expression completely serious. If an outside consulting firm handled a crisis involving our largest client, she asked, looking directly at Gerald, why wasn't the board informed? No one answered. The question hung in the air like a weight. Another executive frowned. So, the company depended on outside intervention and nobody disclosed it? Someone else quietly added, that's a pretty big thing to keep under wraps. My father's eyes darted around the room. For decades, he'd been the one in complete control. The man with every answer. The man everyone respected. Tonight, for the first time, that control was slipping away. And everyone could see it. He opened his mouth as if searching for an explanation. Nothing came. Every excuse seemed to die before it reached his lips. Theo never interrupted him. He didn't need to. The truth had already done its job. The retirement dinner that was supposed to celebrate Gerald Wheeler's remarkable legacy had transformed into something completely different. People were no longer raising glasses in his honor. Instead, they were quietly questioning the foundation of everything they'd admired. Some guests looked disappointed. Others looked genuinely stunned. A few simply shook their heads, realizing the picture they'd believed for years had never been the complete story. Then my father looked at me. Not with anger. Not with frustration. This time, there was something else in his eyes. Disbelief. Almost as if he were seeing me clearly for the very first time. Not as the daughter he'd constantly compared to Preston. Not as someone who had somehow failed to meet impossible expectations. But as a woman who had quietly built a successful life without needing his approval every step of the way. A woman whose husband had just stood in front of 200 people and defended her without hesitation, without asking for recognition, without expecting anything in return. I didn't say a single word. There wasn't anything left to prove. Theo walked back toward me and gently reached for my hand. I smiled through the tears gathering in my eyes. Together, we turned toward the same ballroom doors my father had pointed me toward only minutes earlier. The difference was impossible to miss. A few moments ago, I thought I was leaving in shame. Now, I was walking away with my head held high. No fear. No embarrassment. No regrets. Just the quiet confidence of finally knowing my worth. As we made our way across the ballroom, conversations erupted behind us. Not about retirement. Not about Gerald's speech. Not even about the celebration itself. Everyone was talking about what had just happened. About the truth. About the family they thought they knew. By the time we reached the doors, the applause from earlier felt like it belonged to another lifetime. I paused for just a second before stepping outside. Then I glanced back one last time. My father was still standing behind the podium, completely alone. The crowd he'd spent decades trying to impress was no longer looking at him with admiration. They were looking at him with questions. And for the first time in my life, he had no answers. The cool night air hit my face the moment we stepped outside. For the first time that evening, I could finally breathe. The noise from the ballroom faded behind us as the heavy doors slowly closed, muffling the conversations that were still raging inside. I stood there in silence, trying to process everything that had just happened. 29 years of chasing my father's approval had ended. In the span of a few unforgettable minutes, Theo gently wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. I looked up at him. "For what?" "For not telling you what I planned." His voice carried genuine regret. "I never wanted to blindside you. But when your father told you to leave..." He shook his head. "I couldn't sit there and let him humiliate you again. Not this time." I stared at him for a moment before. A small smile found its way across my face. "You don't have to apologize." He looked surprised. "I'm grateful." Theo searched my face, making sure I meant it. "I spent years hoping he'd finally stand up for me," I admitted. "I kept thinking the next achievement would change everything. The next promotion. The next family gathering. The next conversation." I let out a quiet laugh. I guess I was kidding myself. Theo squeezed my hand. "You were never the problem, Isabel." Hearing those words lifted a weight I'd been carrying almost my entire life. The problem had never been that I wasn't successful enough, or smart enough, or hardworking enough. The truth was much simpler. Nothing I accomplished would have ever been enough for someone who had already decided not to see my worth. For years, I believed earning more achievements would finally earn his love. Now I understood something completely different. Real love doesn't come with impossible conditions. It doesn't demand endless proof. It doesn't make you compete for a place in your own family. A few minutes later, the ballroom doors opened again. Guests began walking outside in small groups. Some recognized us immediately. Several people approached with quiet words of support. One longtime client shook my hand. "I'm sorry you went through that," he said sincerely. "You handled yourself with more grace than most people could." Another former employee smiled warmly. "You should know, a lot of us always respected you." I thanked them, still overwhelmed by everything unfolding around us. It wasn't the public validation that mattered. It was finally realizing I didn't need it anymore. Across the parking lot, I noticed my father standing near the entrance. He hadn't followed us. He simply stood there alone, watching from a distance. For a brief moment, our eyes met. Years ago, I probably would have walked back toward him. I would have searched for an explanation, an apology, anything. Not anymore. Some wounds heal without the apology you spent years waiting to hear. I gave him one final nod. Not out of forgiveness. Not out of anger. But because I was finally ready to move forward. Theo opened the passenger door of our car. As I settled into my seat, I looked back one last time. The retirement dinner everyone would remember wasn't the celebration Isabel Wheeler had planned. It became the night the truth finally walked into the room. The night a lifetime of favoritism unraveled in front of everyone who had believed the carefully polished image. And the greatest lesson I took with me had nothing to do with revenge. It was this. The child who truly honors a family name isn't always the one who receives the praise. Sometimes it's the one who quietly builds an honest life, chooses integrity over approval, and walks away with dignity when respect is no longer being offered. As Theo started the engine, he reached over and intertwined his fingers with mine. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. For the first time in 29 years, I wasn't driving away feeling rejected. I was driving toward a future where my value would never again be measured by someone else's acceptance. Behind us, The lights of the Whitmore Hotel slowly disappeared into the distance. Ahead of us, everything finally felt wide open.